1985, and Carol's asked me to give a little bit about my mother and father. They met after he came home from his mission in England. He stopped to see an old missionary companion, and he suggested that he see this girl, and so when they met, why, they really fell really hard for each other. And so they got married on August the 22nd, 1912, and they went to Catalina Island as part of their honeymoon. I'm sure they went to Los Angeles and San Francisco also. In those days they didn't go in a car, they had a train, and they finally came back to Tooele, and he suggested that they meet, that they live in Tooele for about 5 years. And he says, if you'll stay in 5 years, then I'd like to go to Panaca. Well, he became a lawyer in Tooele, and they stayed 1 year, and then he just got very anxious, and he wanted to go down with the cattle and the horses. So he decided to go along with the idea that she'd just stay a short time, but they lived there for 40 years. They finally moved back up to Salt Lake in about 1956, after he had become very ill. In 1948, he had his first stroke. And my mother had a heart attack in 1953. And so...
Now, were their parents still living?
Oh no. His parents died in 1931.
Do you know their full names? We should probably say full names on the tape.
Nephi John Wadsworth and Eliza Jane Terry Wadsworth was his mother and father. And my mother's mother and father was Robert Aveson and Mary Ann Rollins Aveson. And she died in 1924, so I don't even remember her.
What'd they die of?
Well, I don't know. He died of old age. He was 92. And she was, I don't know for sure how old she was. I could figure it out.
It's okay.
But they had 12 children. And they lived in Salt Lake on 24 M Street.
Florence's parents did?
But some of them died. They told the story about one boy named Franklin, who was about 3 years old, and there was a painter there painting the house one time. And he was used to just running up to this bucket and getting a drink, and the painter had left a cup of turpentine. And he run over and grabbed the cup and drank it. He says, "Oh, Mama," he was dead. And I remember 50 years later, when Grandpa Aveson talked about it, he'd still cry because it upset him so bad, because of course the little baby died. But my dad's mother's parents also had 12 children, and they had a couple of pretty bad accidents too. One boy was named Leo, and he was in Panaca. He was about 16 years old, and he had gone to the old reservoir to hunt ducks, and he was laying down on the ground with his gun laying beside of him, and some ducks come in, and he reached over and grabbed the gun, and he pulled the gun towards him, and it went off. Just blew him away when he was 16 years old. At that time, Grandma and Grandpa was working in the temple in St. George, and they came back, of course, when they heard the news, to bury him and have the funeral and so on, but it was a very sad time. He was just older than Uncle Gene, and Uncle Gene was the youngest of the family. Uncle Gene's the one that moved to Harrican and had a pretty big family himself. In fact, one of his boys is a doctor, and he works with Stephanie out in Bountiful. And I met him the other day. I hadn't seen him for 30 or 40 years. He was just a little kid when I saw him. But my dad wanted to be a cowman and wanted to have cattle and horses. He just loved Panaca, just like Don did. And he wanted to live in Panaca, and my mother just hated it. She never did like Panaca. I guess that's where I got it. I never could hardly stand Panaca. And so, of course, I finally moved to Salt Lake. It took me 40 years to get here, but I finally made it. My dad had been to college and became a lawyer, passed the Utah bar and also the Nevada bar. And of course he could practice in both states, Utah and Nevada. And when I was a little kid, I remember going to Parowan with him a lot because that was the county seat of Iron County. And he's always getting papers and so on for people in Utah. What else can I tell you, Carol?
Why don't you show the pictures?
I got some pictures of them when...
Say their full names when you show them.
Okay, this is Franklin Ernest.
Oh, there's a little glare on there.
Oh.
Too bit,
Can't get it maybe down.
There we go.
Franklin Ernest Wadsworth, born June 10th, 1884. He was 28 when this picture was taken at the time of their marriage in 1912, August 1912. Is that enough?
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And this is the picture of my mother at about the same time. She was 25 years old. Is the glare okay?
Yeah.
I've got a couple more in there, Mother, if you'd like to stop it, Carol.
Okay.
Why don't you just go ahead and stop?
Okay.
This
we're
is
recording
Florence
now.
Mary Aveson Wadsworth, born October the 9th, 1887. So she's about 3 years younger than he was. As soon as you got that,
Let me see if I can.
you got it?
I'm gonna do a close up there.
What?
I don't know how to. They're just the. Huh.
Maybe I'll turn it off while you're fooling with it. Have you got it off?
Yeah, I'll turn it off. There's a close up of it. Okay, go ahead and tell about this one now, Dad.
Well, this was the only picture that any of the kids ever got. I don't know how I ever got it, but she gave it to me, and I'm really glad I've got it. I've also, can I change it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I got one here when she was much younger, I think even before she got married.
How old do you think she is there?
I'd say about 18. Do you think you've got it enough?
Yeah, that's good.
Then I've got one that I found while I was going through the pictures trying to find a lot of FE, but I couldn't find it. I'll find it later. This is when she was quite a bit older. I would say she was
Yeah, that's how I remember her.
about, well, he's got that cable on his arm.
Okay. How old is she here, Dad?
Oh, I'm guessing at about 80. I couldn't say for sure, but it was sometime before she died, and she died at 87 and a half in 1975.
Okay.
Think you got it?
Yeah.
Of course, I guess you wouldn't, since you got a picture, you don't necessarily have to take them, but if you want to, you could. Carol, Mother was really a musician, Carol.
She
That's
sang?
where you got a lot of it. She really sang well. When she moved to Panaca, she's very outstanding. She was very attractive. And a lot of men used to say that they would sure like to have her sing at their funeral. And she used to practice a lot, practice voice and practice piano. And very musically inclined. Of course, my dad was too. He used to play in a dance band, played a piano and played a violin. And I think that's where a lot of the musical talent comes on the children. And I'm real happy for it. I think it's the greatest thing in the world for your kids to be musically inclined. Am I talking loud enough?
Hope so.
You want to ask any more questions, Carol?
Well, talk a little bit now about your brothers and sisters and the family that, your parents had.
Well, the first one was named Franklin Wayne, and he was born on November 13th of 1913. And he was breech, and in those days they didn't know how to handle it. And he only lived just a few hours and died. Then Don was born February the 27th, 1915. So they named him Franklin Don. Of course, he died in 1971. And B was born April the 27th, 1917. She's still alive. Joe was born December the 6th, 1920. And she died on the first day of the year, this year, 1985. And I was born July the 19th, 1923. So I was the baby. Ask me some more questions.
Where did you grow up? Where does your family start? Oh.
Well, they were all born in Salt Lake except Joe, and she was born in Panaca. All the rest of us was born in the Holy Cross Hospital up on First South. Because it was only a couple of blocks to my dad's house, and my mother could walk over.
Oh, is the house still there?
No, they tore it down and made a Waters clinic out of it. It's some kind of a dieting chiropractic clinic now.
Huh.
But there was two houses behind that he owned, and I remember Aunt Mattie lived in one of them, and they're still standing. But the old house itself, where Grandma and Grandpa lived, they tore down in order to build this clinic. He was a staunch temple worker.
Your father?
My grandfather
Your
on
grandfather.
my mother's side. He worked in the temple for over 40 years. And he made 3 trips to England. He went on 2 missions to England and 1 trip just for genealogy. Because he come right from England. In fact, all my parents, all my grandparents, on both sides, all 4 of them came right from England. And my mother got to go over with him the last time we went on genealogy. And it was really an event in her life. She just thought it was wonderful to be able to tour Europe. But the thing that impressed her about more than anything was the Holland flowers.
The what?
The flowers in Holland.
Oh, yeah.
She was just crazy about the flowers in Holland. And for years, she had little Dutch wooden shoes that she set on the piano. And I think probably Joe's got them, Joe's kids got them. Keep asking questions, Carol.
Okay, I'm going to turn it off for just a second.
Sure.
Ting Tang.
This is Grant. My dad's birthday. How old are you, Grant? 29.
29 years old, huh?
Right here. Twice.
Stand over that way, Dad.
Over here?
Yeah, get out of the sunlight. There's Joe. Hi, Joe.
Oh, got it here, not him. Oh, no, not on me, Joe. That's right there. Yeah, I'm camera shy. You're not on now. She's on. She's not on it now. You're not on it now, Carol.
I am. It's going. Dad, you feel good?
Hold it there. Hold it there. Hold it there. No, hold it there. Shake your film, Carol. She can just re-record over it. Oh, you can re-record over it, Carol?
I'm not going to, though. It's your birthday, Dad.
Oh, no, Carol.
Dad, do I have a birthday wish? Birthday advice. Wave at the camera. Look at the camera. Denise!
If you're not on TV,
She is on again.
what are you doing to me?
Jeffrey, why don't you get a job for
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at the Wadsworth reunion.
Oh, man.
That's all I have anything else to say.
Yeah, Joe.
I don't have any.
We got away from you. We
I
got
don't have anything to ask him. You have to write this down first. How old are you today?
29.
29.
Twice. Go!
The lightning. Oh, why not?
Okay, we're getting underexposed.
Okay, Sal, get over.
Just looking down, first south, east. This is November 26th, the day after Thanksgiving. So they just let the lights. There's a lot of traffic out on Main Street for the lighting of the lights up on South Temple. We'll look up Main Street in just a second. This is the Marriott Hotel again. Got quite a bit of traffic out tonight. And as we cut up this way, we take in Nordstrom's, the lights on Main Street. There you can see one of the temple spires with Angel Moroni on it, there above South Temple. And if we keep cutting around this way, we go past the first security building, of course, and then we keep kind of going down. Let's see, there's the ZCMI Center entrance. Then we can kind of look up, but you can't see the mountains of the University of Utah. But the reason I'm turning all the way around is that right here, if I can get it into focus, this is the West Wenbing building where we'll be filming Grant momentarily. It's a great pleasure to conduct this interview tonight with Grant Wadsworth. And since it's possible that some people will be watching this years in the future and not know who we are, I'm going to introduce myself as Joe Wadsworth. I'm Grant's third son in his first family. So what we'd like to do is start off by talking a little bit about your grandfather and great-grandfather on both sides. And then we'll kind of move down and talk about your father and mother, and finally we'll talk about your own sisters and brothers and your own life. Why don't we start on your father's side, if that's okay?
Fine.
Going back to, I guess it would be your great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, and that was,
George Allen.
and the name escaped me for a minute there. Do you know much about, you never met him, of
Oh,
course.
no, I didn't know him. He was dead long
See,
before I ever.
okay. And do you remember what year he was born or what year he died?
Boy, I don't, Joey. I know he joined the church in England.
Okay.
And he come across on a sailboat and brought Nephi John, who was my grandfather,
Uh-huh.
who was born in 1856.
Uh-huh.
And I just heard my dad say how they come in a sailboat from England to the eastern part of the United States.
Okay. Just 1 second here. Okay. That's what we know about him. Tell me again what the year was that he died. As far as
George Allen, I don't know when he died.
Okay, sorry.
I don't know when he died.
Whoops, I kind of got distracted. I asked you that before. Okay, so then we moved down to his son, which was,
Nephi John.
and what do you know about Nephi John?
Only that he was born in 1856, and he come across when he was a baby from England with his dad, George Allen. But that's all I know about. You know, I mean, I remember Nephi John. I remember Nephi John, but not an awful lot of details. I was about 9 years old when he died.
But you met him.
Oh yeah, I met him.
Did he ever tell you any stories that you remember?
No, not that I ever remember of. No, maybe when you talk to Bee, she might remember some stories because she was older.
Do you remember what he died of?
Nephi John, he died of a heart attack. He'd taken a nap in the afternoon, and Uncle Leif, one of my dad's brothers, was just out in the yard watering or something. He'd come in to check on him to see how he was, and he's dead. Died on his afternoon nap. Don't know what he died of. He's an old man. He was up in his 70s, but.
What was his wife's name? Do you remember?
Eliza Jane Terry.
And how many children did he have?
I believe he had 11. But some of them, of course, were lost. Aunt Edna died during the flu epidemic after World War I. And Uncle Leo died in a hunting accident outside of Panaca when he was about 16 years old. Of course, I didn't know them, either one of them.
Okay, now, do you know where Robert Aveson, isn't that your dad's name?
That's my grandfather's name.
Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. I'm getting mixed up. Okay, Franklin Ernest. He was what, where did he fit in the 11
He
children?
was the third child and the second son. The oldest child was Aunt Jenny, and then Uncle Jack, and then my dad was the third child.
And you met many, if not all
Oh,
of
I
his
met them
brothers.
all, yeah.
Sure. What do you remember much about them? Were they...
Uncle Jack went on a mission with Spencer W. Kimball. They were companions in the Central States Mission, and he used to sing beautifully. Spencer W. Kimball could play the piano, and they used to hold street meetings, and he'd call on Uncle Jack to sing. He played piano. And it was,
Oh,
I guess they really made some impression in the central United States, like around Kansas City, Missouri, or somewhere around there is where they were on the mission.
uh-huh. And now, were these mostly religious people in your father's family? Did they tend to be of a religious mind, or?
Well, Uncle Jack went on a mission. Uncle Gene went on a mission. Uncle James went on a mission. But there was several boys, and some of them didn't go. Like Uncle Leif never went. He always believed in tithing, but he never went on a mission.
Well, it was a little different emphasis on missions back in that time, I suppose.
Well, I don't think not too much, because when my dad was the bishop, he sent a lot of people on missions because he was converted.
Right.
He sent a lot of boys back on missions at the time.
Now, your dad was, not to jump to him, since you mentioned he was the bishop, what was that period of time when he was the bishop?
From 1920 to 1928, he was the bishop of Panaca. And his father, Nephi John, was in the bishopric for 27 years before him.
I'll be darned.
And he was a bishop for a long time. In those days, they used to keep him for a long time. 30 years was nothing to keep a man for a bishop. Now, my grandfather wasn't the bishop, but he was in the bishopric for 27 years.
And was that also in Panaca?
Also in Panaca.
Was there just one ward then?
Just one ward. I understand there's two now, but there's only one ward for the first 100 years.
Yesterday when we were talking, and I've forgotten the name, but we were discussing the fact that there was someone back, I guess it could be through your mother's lineage, through the Terry family, that was in the first presidents of the 70.
No, that was my grandmother on my dad's side. Her grandfather
Oh, okay.
was Zerah Pulsifer. And he was one of the seven presidents of 70s, way back in the days of Brigham Young.
Uh-huh. And then you also mentioned that he didn't lose his membership in the church, but what happened exactly?
Well, I think he was just dropped from his quorum in the 70s for overstepping the bounds of his authority.
Uh-huh.
And I always felt, so did my dad always felt, that he married somebody in plural marriage without getting the higher-ups okay. So they dropped him.
Do you remember the year that was about?
No, I could only guess and say it was probably in the 50s.
This is the 1850s?
About 1850, I would say.
Okay, doing great.
Okay.
I just wanted to check, make sure you're completely in the...
Okay, good enough.
Okay, well then, getting back then to Nephi John, we talked a little bit about his family and his wife and their 11 children. Then if we move over to Florence's side of the family,
Yeah.
do you know much about Florence's grandfather?
I remember him. He didn't die until 1939, or Nephi John died in about 1932. For Grandpa Aveson, I remember quite well. I was a teenager when he died. He died in December 1939, and I remember my mother going to Salt Lake on the train. My dad wanted to go, but he had court, and he couldn't get away from court because he was a lawyer, and the judge only come once a month, and he was scheduled to take care of a lot of cases, and he just couldn't postpone it another month.
Now this is your grandpa, Aveson.
Yeah.
And what was his name?
Robert Aveson.
Okay. And what do you know about him, about his...
He joined the church when he was a young boy, about 18 years old, in England. And he was very sickly. He had consumption because of the weather and so on in England. The damp weather and the wind and all was really hard on people's health. And he was told that he wouldn't live until he was 25. But he joined the church and come out here, and he lived till he was 92. Took care of himself, was a strict word of wisdom observer, and the day before he died, my mother told me he walked 20 city blocks the day before he died. And now he was 92 years old.
Now, what year was he born again?
He was born in 1847 in England, the year that Brigham Young got to Salt Lake.
And then he joined the church in his teens.
Yeah, in 1866, he got in Salt Lake in 1866. Of course, Brigham Young was the president of the church then.
Now, how did he get to Salt Lake?
Well, he became a stowaway. He got away on a boat and got to America, and then he walked most of the way across the plains from Omaha. And I've heard him say that when he came into the valley, there was snow on the ground, and he was barefooted.
Wow.
So he really had some hard pioneering days, you know.
Now, but he was very, from what you told me, he was very committed to the church.
Oh boy, he was really committed to the church. And I told you the other day how when he got here and Martin Harris finally joined the church and came to Utah.
After this
yeah.
is after Martin Harris had left the church. and
Yeah,
come
oh
back.
yeah, he had left the church right after when Joseph Smith was alive, he left
Right.
the church. But he never would deny his testimony, but he settled up in Millville, up in Cache County, and Robert Aveson went to see him, which was a long trip in those days from Salt Lake, because they didn't have the cars and things like now. I don't know how he went, whether he went on a bus or, a train, or how he went. But he had a personal interview with Martin Harris, and Martin Harris told him that his testimony was true, that he did see the angel, and that the angel thumbed the golden plates in front of him. And he bore a very strong testimony to my grandfather. Of course, I only get this from my mother's telling me the story.
Oh, so you never actually heard him say that? That was what he said to
I
folks.
never heard him say it. Just heard my mother tell the story. But he was a temple worker for 40 years in the Salt Lake Temple. And he was also a printer for the Deseret News for years. I'd say at least 40 years. He printed the newspaper.
Where did he live in Salt Lake?
24 M Street, which is just about 9th East and South Temple. That's where the old home was.
Oh, okay. Is it still there?
No. Some chiropractor bought it years ago and tore the old house down and made a clinic there, a chiropractic clinic.
Was that a home that he bought, or did he build it?
Oh, boy, now that's a good one. I don't know whether he built it or whether he bought it. I would say he built it because there was 2 homes out in back that he owned. And Aunt Mattie and Uncle Chess lived there when they first got married.
Now, those are sisters?
That
or
was my
moms?
mother's oldest sister.
Okay. And speaking of his family, what was his wife's name again? Do you recall?
Mary Ann Rollins.
Okay, maybe you said that earlier.
Yeah. No,
Sorry.
I didn't. Not today. I
Okay.
might have said it.
And then how many children did he have?
I believe they had 10, but they lost a couple. In those days, the hard living and pioneers, sometimes they lost one. And I remember he told the story of how he had a little boy that the painters were there painting his house one time, and he had a little 4-year-old boy, and his name was Franklin, by the way. And the boy was used to just going and dipping the water out of a bucket to get a drink. The painter had left a bucket of turpentine there, and the little boy just went over and dipped up a cup of turpentine and drank it, and he said, "Oh, Mom," and he just fell right over dead. It just killed him. And 70 or 80 years later, when Grandpa Aveson was telling the story, he still cried about it. It upset him so bad that such a terrible accident could happen to his own child. Just a poor little 4-year-old boy, he didn't know what he was doing. Didn't know there wasn't water.
Did you know anything about his father or Robert Aveson, or the wife's father or parents?
Only that Robert Aveson's father and mother and all of the brothers and sisters came to Salt Lake and joined the church. I remember one old man named Uncle Miles, and he was Robert Aveson's brother. And I remember seeing him in Salt Lake, and he had joined the church later. Robert Aveson came first and joined the church, and then ultimately he got them all to come and join the church.
Just by corresponding with
Well,
them?
corresponding. He made 3 trips back to England. He went as a missionary once, and then he went twice for genealogy.
When he went on his mission, was he married at that time?
Yes, he was married.
Do you remember how long that mission was?
Oh, I'd say at least 2 or 3 years. But I've heard Mother tell it was kind of hard on them because they didn't have, the means and so on. But the church helped out a lot, the missionaries' families, when they went on missions. That was part of the deal.
I never even heard that before. I've heard it, Ezra Taft Benson talk about when his parents went on a mission, but that would have been about the same time period.
I would imagine.
That's really interesting. Okay, so then we go down to his 10 children, and they did lose some, but Florence was certainly one of them.
I remember 3 boys, Uncle Foss and Uncle Bert and Uncle Sam, and I remember them.
What do you remember much about
well,
them, like their characteristics, what type
Just
of
that
people?
Uncle Foss ran the missionary fund. My grandfather left some money in his will to be used by his grandchildren to go on missions, and I got in on it.
Mm-hmm.
And after he died, of course, Uncle Foss was the administrator, and he used to send me a check back in Pennsylvania when I first went on the mission. It seemed like about $30 or $40, for which I was really grateful. And then I remember that his Uncle Foss's granddaughter got in on it, and she lives up on L Street. I see her once in a while. She's older than me. But, of course, that was Uncle Foss's daughter. Her name's Mary Ann.
All right.
Named after Grandma Aveson. Her name was Mary Ann, too. And she's still alive.
Where did Florence fit into that family?
She was next to the youngest.
Okay.
There was the 3 boys, and then there was the 3 girls, and my mother was next to the last girl, Aunt Mattie, and then my mother, and then Aunt Jo Ludlow. She was the last to die, and she lived to be at least 95. Remember her real well. She married Uncle Lud, and he was on a mission when my dad was on a mission in England in 1906, 7, and 8. And when Grandpa Aveson decided to go to England for genealogy, he was going to take Aunt Jo, but Aunt Jo had married him secretly, married Uncle Lud, and she didn't want to go to England for fear they'd find out that she was married before he even went on his mission.
Mm.
And so he chose my mother, and they went to England, and then they went to Holland and Paris, and they went to different places around there. This would be about 1907 or 8. And my mother talked about it until she died, how beautiful the tulips were in Holland. She just went crazy over the flowers in Holland. I guess they really grow pretty flowers over there.
Well, let's go back to your father then. Do you remember the year that he was born?
Sure, 1884, June the 10th, 1884.
And he went on his mission to
England when he was 22 years old. In fact, he had his birthday crossing the ocean in the boat on his way to England. And he stayed until 1924, and he never actually got married until he was about 28. But he came back and started going to law school, and it was then when he met my mother. And they courted for a while and finally got married in 1912.
Do you remember anything that they said specifically about their courtship or when they first met each other? What either Florence or Effie said about the other one?
Well, only that he had a missionary companion that knew her, and the companion introduced him to my mother. And when they met, they fell madly in love with each other. And I thought that was pretty romantic, you know.
What year was Florence born again?
She was born in 1887.
So she was 3 years younger.
3 years younger than Effie.
All right.
October the 9th.
All right. And they got married?
August the 22nd, 1912. And they went on a honeymoon to Los Angeles, and then they took a boat and went to Catalina Island. And boy, this is way back in the days, even hardly before cars were very popular. I guess it was a pretty extensive honeymoon to go that far and go on a boat trip, you know.
I don't even know where Catalina Island is.
Catalina Island's about 25 miles off the coast of Los Angeles.
Okay.
It's an island, and they have songs about it. It was a pretty romantic place in those days. I guess it was honeymoon Mecca.
Where were they married?
They got married in the Salt Lake Temple.
Okay. So that would mean that all their children were born under the covenant.
Oh yes, they all got married. They all were born under the covenant.
And they had how many children?
My mother had 5 children, but the first one died. He was breech, and they didn't know how to take care of him in those days. They didn't have the expertise that the doctors have now.
Sure.
And so he only lived a few hours, and then he died. His name was Franklin Wayne, and he was born November the 7th, 1913, about 14 or 15 months after they got married.
And then the next child was,
Don. And so they named him Franklin Don, and he was born February the 27th, 1915.
and why don't we talk for a second about Don? Don would have been 7 years older than you, 8 years older?
About 8.5 years old.
Okay.
I was.
And do you remember anything about Don growing up with his brothers?
Yeah, he was a great horseman. He was really a singer. When he went to the BYU, he studied voice, and he really could carry a tune, boy. He really had a nice voice.
What was
Had
he a
lot of
tenor?
training. No, he was a baritone.
He was a baritone, and did he sing like in choirs or?
He sang solos in church and in Sunday school and different festivities in Panache in the ward.
Any particular songs that you remember him singing that he really liked?
Stephanie was playing one the other day called Chloe on the piano, and I said, boy, Don used to sing that all the time.
Darn.
She said she really liked it. Stephanie liked it. She was just learning how to play it.
You grew up in Panaca with Don and your other two sisters, which we haven't talked about yet, Joe and Bee, but what kind of chores or what kind of activities did you do there? Did you just go to school, or did you work? Or?
I had to milk 2 and 3 cows every morning before I went to school.
All right.
I'd get up and milk the cows and bring them home. Mother would strain them, and put them away. And I'd come home at night, and I had to feed cattle and water horses and so on. I was just a typical farm boy.
Right.
When it come to the hay, we had to put up hay, and in those days it was before balers.
Right.
So we had to pitch it both ways, pitch it on the wagon and then pitch it on the stack. Stack it in the stack yard.
Uh-huh. And so you worked with Don?
Yeah, I worked with Don, and my dad always had hired men, always had 1 or 2 hired men to help out.
Because you had a big farm, or?
Well, he had quite a bit of land. He had the Sorry farm, which Scott still has down in Panaca.
Now
He got
Scott's Don's.
Don's third boy.
Okay.
He's the same age as Leslie.
All right.
And he had a lot of Don in him, and he looks like Don, and he acts like Don, and he likes Panaca. And so he wanted to stay and try to do the farming, but nobody could make a living in Panaca farming, not in the Wadsworth couldn't. The Sorry farm was alkali, and you couldn't even raise a row. You know what alkali is?
Mm-hmm.
It's a salt solution that comes up out of the ground, and they have ways of trying to combat it. Don spent a lot of money trying to combat this alkali, but he put a lot of fence in, he put a lot of land under cultivation, but he never really could make a living. And so he was like my dad. My dad became a lawyer because he wanted to live in Panaca, and he had to make enough money to pay for the farm, so to speak. And when Don come along, he wanted to be a farmer and a cowman, and so he became an insurance agent, so he could afford to live in Panaca.
And then he went on to marry
Sylvia
Hinckley, which is
Gordon's youngest sister.
Gordon B. Hinckley, who's in the first presidency now.
And Joe married his brother, Sherman B. Hinckley.
Now, what were they both younger than Sherm? Do you know the order of the children?
Gordon was the oldest.
And then
Sherm was next. And then there was the 3 girls. There was Ruth, who died quite some time ago of cancer, and Ramona is still alive, and her husband just died. And of course, Sylvia died at 49 of cancer after having 11 children.
Had 11 children with Don, and they raised them in Panaca.
Raised them in Panaca.
They stayed.
Yeah, and Terry and Scott still live in Panaca. Brent lives in Fallon.
And I remember when we talked about this before, the comment that was made was, I think Reba was the one that said this, that Sylvia spent a lot of time with her children.
Oh, her whole life was her children, especially when she got sick. She got so sick, for 8.5 years she was an invalid, and she just sat in a big chair. And she couldn't hardly get around or do anything. And the kids would come around, and she'd tell them stories and talk to them and teach them Mormonism. And they all turned out very religious. Every one of them. I don't know of one of Don's kids that isn't religious. He's had stake presidents and bishops, high councilmen. And he had 7 sons, and all 7 of them went on missions for the church. 4 of them after he was dead, if you can imagine, which I think is really a record.
And then all 11.
Yeah,
were married in the temple.
All 11 of them got married in the temple, and they married bishops or few high men in the church. Terry married a stake president when she got married, and she had 11 children. She still lives in Panaca.
Then let's shift gears a little bit and move on then to let's see, who's next? B.
B.
And what year was B? You know, the year and date.
April 27th, 1917.
And she is let's see, went on and had how many children?
She had 6 children that lived, but she actually gave birth to 12. But she lost 6 through miscarriages or stillborn or stillbirth. Some of them even lived a while and then died right after.
Right.
I don't know why, but she had a hard time. She did have 6 children, and 3 of her boys went on missions, and one of them is now an MD down in Louisiana.
What's his name again?
His name's Randy.
Yeah, I forget.
He never did go on a mission. He's the same age as Mark.
I've met him, but I don't remember him very well because I've only seen him like once. But so let's see, B is now, I guess, about 76 or so. 77. And she hasn't had the best of health.
No, she has myasthenia gravis, and I'd never even heard of it until she got it. But it's a disease of the nerve endings, and sometimes she has a hard time talking or chewing. Her tongue doesn't work exactly right. But she's under medication now, and she has days when she can talk pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And there's days when she has a hard time even talking, but she can talk with kind of a slur sometimes.
Now, when you grew up with Don and B in Panaca, do you remember anything maybe out of the ordinary that happened, or what kind of a relationship did you have? Did you play around with each other? Were you serious kids?
Yes, we played all the time, and I remember there was a couple of burros come one time, and Don put B on the burro, and she'd never ridden one. She's just a little girl, and when she come to turn, just go around the house, she didn't know how to pull the rein to make him go around the house, so she says, "Turn, turn," and they get quite a laugh out of it because here she was talking to the burro, telling him to turn, and she didn't know how to pull the rein.
That is pretty cute.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of school system did you have anyway? Was it just one school for everybody, or did they have grade schools?
Well, they had a grade school, 8 grades in the
Okay.
grade school, Old Panaca Grade School, and then they had the high school right by it, which is the Lincoln County High School, and the whole county counted them. Until finally they got one in Alamo, which is about 60 miles west of Panaca.
Right.
But Kellyanne and Pioche, to this day, still bus their children to the high school in Panaca. Because Panaca was in the middle. Pioche was 12 miles to the north, and Kellyanne was 15 miles to the south. And they were much bigger towns.
Mm-hmm.
But they decided to make the county high school in Panaca because we were centrally located. So I only lived a block and a half from the school.
So you grew up there with Don. One thing that we haven't mentioned, we kind of moved on and I forgot about it. We didn't talk much about Don's mission this time.
Well, he went on a mission to New Zealand when he was 18 years old. 1933 he was called, and he went by boat to New Zealand, and it was a long, hard way. And one of his mission presidents was Rufus K. Hardy, and he was one of the 7 presidents of 70s later on in his life. And Don got very homesick. He lived in the Indians, the natives. They're like Hawaiians or Polynesians. And it tells in the Book of Mormon about some of the people going to the islands down in the South Pacific. And New Zealand was one of them. They were very, very faithful people. He told the story about one man, an old native, that actually raised people from the dead. He had so much faith, and he had the priesthood. This is way back in the old days, but Don says he can remember what a great man this was. He even told me his name, and I forgot his name. But Matthew Cowley went down there as a young boy before Don, and then later on he went back as the mission president after Don.
Okay.
But Don knew him in Salt Lake, and he was one of the greatest men the church, I think, ever produced. His father was Matthias Cowley, He was one of the 12 apostles back in the days of the turn of the century. But he was dropped from the quorum of the 12 because he didn't.
Matthew Kelly?
Matthias.
Oh, Matthias, sorry.
Because he didn't agree with the stand on the manifesto.
Well, that's right. And then
Him
there
and
was
John
another-
W. Taylor.
there was
John
two of
W.
them.
Taylor, who was John Taylor's son, and he was an apostle.
Right.
And they both resigned in 1907, I believe. And I remember when Matthew Kelly got chosen, my dad saying he couldn't help but feel like that was to kind of appease the treatment that his father got, because the father resigned, and with the understanding that eventually they'd let him back in, but they never did let him back in the quorum of 12. So they did choose his son, and his son was very outstanding. I remember him really well. He died in, I'd say, about 1957. And when he'd talk in conference, he belonged to AA, and he had been pretty wild in his youth. And he said that when he'd run into a drunk on the street, he'd say, "There, but for the grace of God goes I." Because he said he really had a hard time. After he'd been on a mission and everything, he had a hard time with the word of wisdom. But when he got older, he overcame it. And
This is Matthias.
Matthew, this is
Matthew.
Matthew.
Sorry, I'm thinking ahead about some questions I'm going to
That's
ask
all
you.
right.
Sometimes I forget which name. Okay, since we're talking about some of the events that have happened, do you remember much about the Depression? I mean, what you were in Panaca.
It was there in 1929. The big crash come. I was 6 years old, and it lasted through the 30s.
But were you you're probably so young, maybe you didn't really.
Well, I never really felt it, Joey, because my dad was a lawyer, and he made more money than the average person, and
Okay.
we never felt the pinch. But boy, he had people that worked for him for $1 a day, and that was considered good wages during the Depression. And he had guys that come and pitch hay, that do the watering, that take care of the stock and so on, and he paid $1 a day. And boy, they were glad to get it. And they could live good on $1 a day, even with a family.
What kind of an attorney was he anyway?
Well, he became the district attorney for 14 years. He prosecuted the criminals. And he never lost a case. He had one hung jury on the murder, had some of the most famous murder cases that was ever tried in Nevada.
Do you remember any of the names?
Yeah, one of them, the most famous of all, got national recognition, was called the Marlock and Carter case. And they came out from the east, and their father had a rich mining claim out in Pioche, or near Pioche. And these boys, the son and the son's friend, decided to plot to kill their father so they could get the money. And they actually killed their own father, the one boy.
Be darned.
And boy, it lasted a long time.
The
But
jury,
the
court
trial,
proceeding, sure.
yeah. But they finally convicted him. And it got national recognition. It was all over the United States they talked about it.
Okay, I don't mean to jump back and forth,
No,
but
that's all
since
right.
we're talking about your dad for a second, you mentioned that he was the bishop, and we talked a little bit about his mission. But do you remember some of the things that he ever said about his testimony of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and the Latter-day Work?
He really believed in the gospel, and he was a great believer in tithing. And he told the story, and I remember this, how one time he had gone into debt for some stock, and he had a note that he had to meet, and he had no way in the world to get the money. So he went in, he prayed to the Lord, and he says, "If you'll give me, I think it was $2,500, he said, I'll give you 20% tithing."
Made a deal with him,
Yeah,
huh?
he made a deal with the Lord. And so one day he was in his office, and this was after he was out of politics and was no longer district attorney. He was just practicing law on his own, and he concentrated mostly on divorce and estates in his latter years.
Okay.
And he was sitting there, and all of a sudden a man walked into his office, and he says, "My name is Ben Valjean." I'll never forget it. He was from Michigan. And he had decided he was the man who invented the the oil stove. They used to put oil in them, light them. And I can't remember the name of the stove, but he came in and he says, I want a divorce. He says, my wife's gonna try to get all my money. And he had quite a bit of money, you know. But he says, how much is it gonna cost? And my dad says, it's gonna cost you $5,000, kind of joking. And the guy kind of drew back and he says, man, alive, I didn't know it cost that much. And he says, well, that's just a starter. We'll have to see what it amounts to. But when he left his office, he gave him $2,500, and that's what he'd asked the Lord for. And I went with my dad when he went down to the bishop and paid 20%.
Oh, is that
That
right?
night. He had to keep his word with the Lord because it was a miracle. You know, here he prayed for the $2,500, and the man walked in, and his whole life he never got that much for a divorce. Now they get thousands, you know, but boy, we're talking way back in the, I'd say, the early 40s, maybe even the late 30s when he got this divorce with this guy. It went on for a long time.
No, he went on and had a stroke. When was that?
He had a stroke January the 12th, 1948 was his first stroke. But he had 2 or 3 of them. Finally, the second or third one made it so he couldn't talk. He couldn't talk. About all he could do was just whistle or use his hands. But it left him, he was an invalid for 12 and a half years. He couldn't bathe himself or shave himself or even dress himself.
And who were the people that were involved in taking care of him during that time?
Well, my mother took care, and she waited on him hand and foot, but I was there, and I always bathed him and shaved him and got him dressed and took him for walks and took him for rides in the car and took him down to get his hair cut and so on. And finally, when they moved to Salt Lake, I did the same thing, because I had, in the meantime, moved to Salt Lake.
So your mother was involved with it, and you were involved with it,
You know,
and I guess whom Reva was to a certain extent.
Reva really was. When my mother had a heart attack in about 1956, it almost killed her. And so the last thing she said was, she thought she was going to die, and she said, I want you to take care of my dad. And so he moved right in with me and Reva, and she had little children. She had Leslie, Mark. I don't know whether Jeffrey was born or not.
Well, Jeff was born in
51.
51. This was 56.
No, he had his first stroke in 48, but he moved up here, I would say, in about 52.
Uh-huh.
So maybe even Janet was born by then, because she was born in 52.
What did your father say was the most important, or some of the important things to him, or did he ever talk about his great accomplishments? Or
He said the most important thing is to teach your children religion, and then after religion, you teach them music. And boy, he really stressed the music, and that's why Don went on to be a singer, and Beam played the piano really, really quite well, and Jo played the piano, and she tap danced. She was just into everything. She was the drum majorette for the band at Lincoln County.
uh-huh.
She was very musically inclined. All the kids were.
What else did he? Was there anything else that he talked about? I guess was his greatest accomplishment his family? Did he feel?
Oh,
very,
sure.
Was he really proud of that? Was he proud of some other things that he had done?
Well, he always wanted to be a farmer and have a cow herd, and when he died, he had about 100 horses.
Uh-huh.
Just run wild. Some of them became real good horses, though. He had some fine saddle horses, and never any race horses or anything like that, but he did have some nice horses.
Were there any significant events in his life? Maybe when he met maybe some important person, or that he went on a trip somewhere, or I'm trying to just think.
Well, Heber J. Grant was his mission president
Okay.
when he was on a mission.
Uh-huh.
In 1906, 7, and 8, President Grant had gone over in about 1904 to avoid some of the statements he had made on polygamy, and they were after him. And he rode a horse from Farmington over to Morgan and caught the train in Morgan, and then he went back to New York and caught a boat and went to England. And this was about 1904, I'd say, about the time of the Smoot investigation.
You know, Heber J. Grant, he became the president of the church in like 1918 or something.
1918.
So he was just a member of the 12 at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
He was put in the member of the 12 in 1882 by revelation. John John
Okay.
Taylor received a revelation and told him to put George Teasdale and Heber J. Grant in the 12 Apostles. And Seymour B. Young, who was Levi Edgar Young's father, and I remember Levi Edgar Young, he was one of the 70s, but his father was a 70 also.
Heber J. Grant was 25, I think, when he was called to be an apostle. wasn't he?
26, I think.
Yeah.
He was very young, and he was lived in Tooele. But he was an apostle in 1882, and finally became president of the church in 1918. And he lived to be 1945 when he finally died. But he was president of the church longer than any other man except Brigham Young.
And he was your dad's mission president.
He was
for
my
part of the
dad's
time.
mission president. And when it came time for me to go on a mission, I had a terrible time because the war was on. I was too young, and I wanted to go on a mission. And
What year was that?
1940. Well, I went on a mission in 1942.
So this was right when
Right
the
at the
Japanese
beginning of the-
attacked.
right at the beginning of the
Right after
war.
that. Okay.
And I told my dad that if he would go with me and talk to Heber J. Grant, that I could go,
Uh-huh.
even though the rules were that you weren't supposed to go.
Uh-huh.
But they weren't drafting 18-year-olds at that time. And I went on a mission when I was 18. But of course, when we went to see Heber J. Grant, he was in California, very sickly towards the end. It was the last 3 years of his life. So he had a home in California where the president of the church could go down and get away from it all for a while. And he was down to this home. And so when we went to the church office building, David O. McKay was his counselor, and he was running the church. And we went in to see David O. McKay, and Claire Middlemas come out, his secretary. And so I said, we got to see David O. McKay. And she says, have you talked to the bishop and the stake president? I said, we sure have. And she said, she finally went in the other room, and she came out and says, you got 5 minutes. And we talked to David O. McKay for over an hour. And he agreed that I could go on a mission.
Do you remember some of the other things that he said during that hour? That sounds kind of an interesting interview.
Well, they talked a lot about my mother's father. He was a very faithful man in the church.
Robert Aveson.
Robert Aveson, and he was a good friend of George F. Richards. Now, George F. Richards was the Grand Richards' father.
Okay.
And I went and had an interview with him one time, and I remember him saying to me, he said, boy, if you're half the man that your grandfather was, he said, you'll be all right. He said he'd known my grandfather for years. He was as faithful a man as he ever met in the church.
Do you remember anything else that he said during that time when you talked to David O. McKay with your father?
The generalities mostly that my dad had been on a mission, and Heber J. Grant was his mission president, and he became a lawyer and had lived out in Nevada. But Don had gone on a mission to New Zealand, and I can't remember any specific stories that he told.
Oh, that's fine. But nonetheless, you were called on a mission, and in 1942, and what day was that?
Well, I entered the mission home about, I'd say, the first part of June, because I got in New York on the 28th of June. We usually had to go to the mission home for about 2 weeks. At that time, the mission home was in Salt Lake, on just above South Temple, between South Temple and North Temple.
Oh, wait a minute.
On State Street.
This was, so you were almost 19, is that right?
Yeah, I would have been 19 the next month by the time I finally went, but I had been trying to go for over a year. See, I graduated from high school in 1941, and then 5 months later, Pearl Harbor hit in December.
But they weren't drafting young
no.
18-year-olds.
They didn't start drafting 18-year-olds until after I'd been on a mission a couple of months. I'd say September of 42 when they started drafting the 18-year-olds.
Were you eligible for that draft?
I would have been if I hadn't been on a mission, but because I was on a mission, I was classified as 4D, which is a minister, like a Catholic priest or
I'll be darned.
like that. That's the reason I didn't have to go. But the second I got off the mission, boy, they were waiting for me, and they drafted me in the Army as soon as I got off the mission.
Like how much time went by? Like a week or a month or
Oh,
something?
no, I'd say, well, I went into the Army in December of 1942, 1945.
Well, when did the war end?
The war ended in the spring of 1945. So I hadn't been in very long.
Wait, so you went in December of 44.
44, that's right.
3 months before.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they dropped the bombs in Japan I would say in April or May of 1945. And boy, that was the turning point of the war. When we got the atomic bomb, boy, that's what stopped it all.
But help us out here. You actually lived through this, which, you know, many of us never did.
Oh,
We've read
yeah.
about it, but what do you remember about the whole war experience, about hearing about Hitler come to power? And
You can't imagine, Joy, how the war changed people's lives. Like the railroads, just for instance, the railroads. Caliente and Pioche have never boomed like that before or since. During the war, there was so many trains going through Caliente all the time, and Pioche, because of the lead and zinc and the metals and so on, they had all kinds of miners that worked there. And they could get deferments. Dean was a miner all of his life.
now, Dean, that's
Bee's husband, Dean Theriot.
right.
And he got a deferment because he was a miner. He was in the Army for a while, but then they come in one time and says, anybody that's a miner and can prove they've been a miner for a long time can go out and go to mining. So Dean was in a mine all of his life. And so he didn't have to go to the service. Even though he was married and had a couple of kids, he didn't ever go.
Well, was he working in a mine down there in Pioche, or was he
Well,
up
he
in,
was-
by Eureka in Nevada?
Well, he lived in Eureka. The last 30 years he lived in Eureka. But he'd been in Timpute where they had tungsten for years. When Reeve and I got married, we went to Timpute and I drove a truck for him. And he had a mine there then where they had tungsten. And that's what they put in light bulbs. That very, to keep machine gun barrels cool. I don't understand it exactly, but it was very precious stuff during the war. They called it tungsten.
Well, when you heard about Hitler coming to power, I mean, what were the feelings about the war? What was that like to live through that and everything?
Hitler was really a hated man, and he was trying to take over the world, boy.
Right.
And if he'd have had his way, he would have taken over the world. And if it hadn't been for America, we'd have lost.
But were people really pro, let's go to war and let's fight?
Oh,
What
yes.
the
It was a
sentiment?
very popular war.
Okay,
Because the Japs had hit Pearl Harbor, an unprovoked attack.
right.
And they killed about 3,000 men and sunk our fleet right in Pearl Harbor.
Where were you? Do you remember when you heard about that?
I see. Well, yeah, I was in state conference. Isn't that a coincidence? And when I come out, between the two sessions, it was in Caliente. Joseph Fielding Smith and John A. Witzel were the visiting authorities. And my dad was going to talk to him about me going on a mission, which he did. And I remember coming out and some kid says, hey, they just hit Pearl Harbor. The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor. And I said, well, where's Pearl Harbor? I never even heard of it, Well, it was a very famous harbor in Oahu, in Hawaii. Karen's been there. She's seen it. One of the ships just sunk, and they never did even try to raise it or anything. There was a lot of people died when it went down. They couldn't get them out. And they said you could hear the taps for several days. They were tapping on the walls trying to get out, But the ship after was already down in the water.
You mean because they had people down?
There was people in the bottom of the ship that never could get out of the
How
ship.
could you hear the taps under the water, though?
Well, they said that they had divers down there to see if they some way they'd get them out, and they could hear them tapping on the walls for several hours before they finally ran out of oxygen or the water got them or something, and the ship was still there.
Oh.
But practically the whole fleet was downed in Pearl Harbor.
Uh-huh.
They didn't have any idea that they had done that much damage. The Japs didn't. And had they have known, they could have come right over the top. They could have come right into Los Angeles. They could have bombed the West Coast if they'd have known how much damage they did. Because we were not prepared. We had no idea they were going to hit us. It just banged all at once. And I believe there was 2,700 American soldiers killed at Pearl Harbor in one just a big attack. They had several bombing fleets.
And so basically, there was a pro-war sentiment, but you decided, but you went on the mission. I remember one time you said when you came up and talked to David O. McKay, and you went back down, maybe this was sometime later. Actually, back in those days, you were traveling in what kind of cars? I mean, they weren't Model Ts. They were.
No. See, this was
What was the
in
speed
the
you were
40s. During the war, they had a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit. You weren't supposed to drive more than 35 miles an hour.
How fast could the cars go?
Oh, heck, they could go real fast. My dad had a 19, he bought a 1950 Hudson,
Uh-huh.
and it was a going machine. It was really go. V8,
When you say go, you mean like,
80 or 90 miles an hour.
oh, really?
Oh, yes.
Well, why was it 35? Because the roads weren't
Well,
good?
no, because when the war was on, they were trying to conserve energy, and they were trying to conserve tires. They didn't want to burn the gas all up in high speeds. And so they set a national speed limit of 35 miles an hour.
So when you went back from Salt Lake to Panaca, you were going 35 miles an hour?
Well, we drove a little more than that. We really weren't supposed to. But see, my dad and mother was up here, and David on the case says you'll have to go home and have all these papers filled out and have a physical and have your your farewell and everything. And this was, he told me on a Friday afternoon.
Uh-huh.
So the next day, we spent at least 9 hours getting to Panaca. We used to go through Wendover and then to Ely and then down. That's before the freeways.
Right.
And I remember the next morning, I got up, went to priesthood and to Sunday school, and then in between after Sunday school, I rushed to PO, which we called Dr. Hastings, an old guy that had been there for years and years and years, and he gave me a physical examination. And then I come back, and I had to have the bishop make out a lot of papers, and the stake president make out a lot of papers. And then I talked in church that night. We had church in the evening. And it seems like a church started at 7 o'clock at night. I remember when I went, I had to talk that night. My dad talked. It seems like Don talked.
Just got a phone call. I thought just while he's on the phone, I'd just take a second and show you the inside of the bank here. I guess if they knew that we were in here doing this, they'd probably be a little suspicious since the bank's closed. But as I mentioned earlier, this is the day after Thanksgiving, so we got the Christmas tree out, got these gigantic little light bulbs, got the little teller machines over there. In fact, if we come all the way around this way, I'm probably going too fast. Dad, I'm trying to get you on the film. We run into the security guard. Dad's always worked 2 jobs, a lot of times in banks, and what are some of the other locations you've worked in?
I worked at Shinnecock. I worked at trucking companies, health, hospitals.
Now this has always been a second job, just
Always been a second job for.
to make additional income. And
Oh, my God, my phone.
go ahead, go ahead. This is what he looks like when he walks. I don't know if he'd appreciate that. But anyway, Dad just had his 70th birthday. Guess there's nothing really that interesting about this bank anyway. I guess I'll stop. First security bank sign. Boy, that's an old sign. I don't know how long that thing's been around. I don't know if you can see it through the reflection in the window. Camera doesn't know what to focus on. But as we come down this way, don't want to make anybody nauseous. We're looking at, this is again, we're looking up Main Street. It's kind of hard to see out there. But you can see the Key Bank building. Used to be Commercial Security Bank, then they changed the name. Nordstrom's out of Seattle. I used to buy my clothes there until they got too expensive. I still like to go on there on sales and buy stuff, but who can afford it? In here, we got a little distraction with the telephone call, but we're trying a little camera vantage point so you can see this handsome guy here. That would be me. Oh, no, you. You know, they say that you get baldness from your mother's side. Have you ever heard
Your
that?
mother's father's side.
Well, one thing I noticed yesterday when I was doing the filming of you, you know, if you notice my bald spot right here,
Yeah.
and then, now, would you be so kind as to show the camera your bald spot? Okay, you
I
know
don't
what?
like you, Sam.
I was just going to demonstrate that I think you get it from your father's side, because our bald spots are exactly the same.
Well, I guess, but Don had more hair than anybody I ever knew, any man who I ever knew. He really had a lot of hair. But Robert Aveson had hair, a lot of hair, and Karen's dad had a lot of hair. That's why Karen's kids have got so much hair. I'm sure they got it through Karen's dad's side.
Now, this is Karen, your second wife.
Yeah.
Sure. But we're going to come back to the war, and you went into the mission field during the war.
Yeah.
What was the talk of the people when you were in the mission field? What were they saying about the war? I mean,
Well, everybody was anxious for us to win and for Hitler to be captured and to be conquered and to get the world back to normal. It was really an uproar from 1941 till 1945 when he finally killed himself. The Japs finally surrendered.
Now, of the friends that you went to high school with, and were there very many that were killed in the war?
A lot of them. It really shattered the class that I was in. I was in the class of 41, and it was the biggest class that ever attended Lincoln High when I was a freshman, like about 80 or 85 freshmen. And they've never had one that before or since. But a lot of the fellows that was in my class, to say nothing about a lot of the people in the school, were killed during World War II, several of them.
Now, of course, now I guess when you go back a couple of classes like that, those would be the ones that got hit the hardest.
No, there was a lot in my class. Because see, I was 18 and all of my friends were 18, and the following year, they were all in the Army, and a lot of them were in Burma, Japan, South Pacific, and Europe, all through Europe. I was on the way to be in the Army of Occupation. My outfit was.
And what happened?
Well, I got a fluke. I got out of the Army and went back on another mission.
But when you were in the mission field in the Eastern States mission,
Pennsylvania and New York.
those were the main. New York City.
No, I didn't work right in the city.
Oh,
the
okay.
headquarters was in New York. I've been there a lot of times, but I was in western Pennsylvania mostly, and in Camorra,
Right.
where they had the hill for Camorra, the pageant. So, but during the war, they didn't have the pageant because they didn't want big crowds to be together. And during the war, they didn't even hold big general conferences because they didn't want to have 20,000 people up on Temple Square and have somebody drop a bomb on them. It just cleaned it right out, cleaned some 20 people out.
So when you were out in the mission field, how was it that you proselyted? Did you go door to
House
door?
to house, door to door, tracting.
Did you do street meetings also?
No, they would never let us do street meetings. I always wanted to, but they never would let us do street meetings. They were successful in the South doing that, but in the East they didn't want us to. There was too many hecklers, and they said, "Oh, they'll make fun of you about your hauling on the streets," and people aren't that interested in the East. But in the South, they were very successful with street meetings.
Well, when you did have an opportunity to teach people, in those days, they didn't have prepared lessons.
No, everything was done by inspiration. You prayed and you fasted and you asked the Lord to lead you to where the people were. And I liked that, but I don't know that we were as successful as they are today with this planned attack, so to speak. The missionaries had a lot more converts. It was a lot harder in my day because they'd look at us like we were draft dodgers. And they'd call us draft dodgers. And how come you're not in the Army? How come you're out peddling Mormonism? And so on. And you had a lot to overcome because I was out all the time during the war.
Well, when you did have an opportunity, to teach them, you would teach them. I mean, would you talk about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and the First Vision?
We'd give them the Book of Mormon a lot, and we had little records that we played on the history of the church. And we'd go house to house and knock on doors and ask them if we could leave them a tract and see if they'd invite us in. But the people weren't near as cordial, especially during the war. And in the big cities of the East, they just weren't as friendly as they are now.
And I think one thing I kind of want to point out is that even though at this point you do have differences with the church leaders, you have always maintained a strong testimony of Joseph Smith.
Well, sorry, the only difference between me and you and the church, Joey, is I accept Joseph Smith and his teachings with no changes.
Right.
Where the church has their modern revelation and they change different doctrines and different principles that I don't believe in.
Exactly. And but with respect to the Book of Mormon, you do believe.
I really believe in the Book of Mormon.
And I've always been impressed with your knowledge of. I've always been impressed with your knowledge of church history. I know that you've read some of those books.
I read the journals.
How many times?
Oh, I'm going through them now for about the 8th time.
These are the Journal of Discourses by Brigham
26
Young.
volumes. over 10,000 pages. From 1852 to 1886.
Just a second.
That's on. You got it on.
Yeah, I got it on. Just trying to make this thing mobile, and I can't. Okay, well, let's pick up there where we were. We talked about the way that you proselyted during that time period, and a little bit about your feelings about the church. When you came home, you were in the Army for a time, then you got a release, and then you went on a second mission. And who did you go on this mission with?
Well, with my sister Jo.
Okay.
She had already gone out the summer before, and we met in New York. Had a nice time in New York. I remember the hotel bill was $80. And now you couldn't even get one for one night. And we spent 8 nights for $80 in New York, just off Times Square.
And this was in 1940?
1943.
43.
The war was on. It was almost impossible to get a hotel room. We just looked and looked. I just ran all over New York trying to find a hotel room. 509 hotels in New York City. Boy, I must have called on 50 or 60 of them before I finally got a room. And it was just a fluke when we finally got the room.
Mm-hmm.
Some guy went in and says, I got a reservation. I went in right behind him, and boy, he just insisted he was going to have a room, and the guy finally says, they argued. Finally, the guy says, okay, you can have the room. Then he looked at me and he says, what can I do for you? And I says, I got a room too, and I want one now.
So this was when you first went, or on the way back?
No, been out about a year when Jo came. And
Okay.
She had to go back to school. This was September of 43. I went out in June of 42. So I've been out about 15 months. And I met Jo and went to Oklahoma.
To play?
First coming out.
I'll be darned.
I know this guy, I just saw him today on television. Famous singer. Howard Keel was just a young man. He sang the lead in Oklahoma.
I'll be darned. Okay, so now I remember that you said after your second mission, you spent some time with Jo in New York. Is this the time, or was that another time?
No, after the second mission, I went to New York and met her there again.
Okay, so there was 2 times you met her.
Oh yeah, we went to New York twice. Oh, we really had time. Nobody's lived till they've seen New York, Joey. Nobody's lived till they've been to New York. I know you've been there, but it's really something to see. But you went at the wrong time. You went when it was really cold weather.
Oh yeah.
If you could have gone in the summer, I think you'd appreciate it a lot more, and you got around a lot easier than being drowned every day.
Now, you and Jo are how many years apart?
She was born in 20, I was born in 23. 3 years apart.
Okay, and you were pretty close then growing up?
Oh, we were really close. A lot closer than Bee and I ever were, because Jo was really religious. She was really concerned with the family, and much more than Bee was. And yet Bee's got a lot of wonderful virtues.
Now, Jo, I remember her commenting a couple of times before she died, that she was always impressed with how hard you worked. You always had carried on 2 jobs.
Well, I about had to, Joe, as a matter of necessity. I decided I was going to have a big family.
Yeah.
When I got converted to the fullness of the gospel, I set my goal for 50 children. 50.
Right.
Well, if I could have met a couple more Karens, I'd have probably made it, but when you have a big family, even in those days, it takes a lot of money. My first 2 children only cost $150
When they were born.
when they were born. Leslie and Mark, $150. The last 2, Chris and Frank, were $5,000 each. That's how much in my lifetime. Inflation took medical service to the hilt. And now, to have a baby now, it costs you minimum be $5,000. It costs $1,000 a night to go to the hospital.
Okay, so I remember that you also said when you were talking with Jo back in New York, that you talked about how many kids you each wanted to have.
She told me we were living in this hotel, and she says, I'm going to have 12 children. I'm gonna have 12 children, girl, so that's her golden life, to have 12 good kids.
And that this was in what year she said that?
1943.
Okay, so she came home from her mission then,
And she never got married till 1947.
and she married Sherman.
Sherman. And they had 7 children.
7 kids. And now Joe was very active in the church.
Boy, she was really active. She was into everything in the church. She taught the state conferences. She was a very distinguished orator. She highly educated. She was the valedictorian.
Uh-huh.
She was the junior prom queen. She was voted the most popular girl in school.
Uh-huh.
She was the drum majorette. She was in all the honor plays. Joe was really outstanding. She was the valedictorian.
And she did, all of her children were very accomplished also.
Yeah, she had some pretty outstanding kids.
Now they have had some trouble with,
Yeah, Francie and Wayne, both born on the same day, 5 years apart. But they both have retinitis pigmentosus, which is the disintegration of the retina in the eyes. They eventually go blind. And I talk to Wayne quite often, and Helen come out, Frances come out. She lives in Michigan. She went back there with the idea of becoming a doctor in outdoor survival.
uh-huh.
And she got sick, but she got a job working back there, and she still has the job, but they cut her way back. But she does everything by memory. Maybe you can remember when Joe died, she talked at the funeral. Boy, she really did a good job.
Mhm.
All through memory. So, it was wonderful.
So now Joe, what was her address? Where did she live up in South?
2579 Beacon Drive, which was up about 15th south, 29th east.
And you remember what ward she was in? Wasn't it the Monument Park?
Monument Park Ward.
And this is the Monument Park Steak, I
Yeah,
suppose.
it's a Monument Park State. She lived up there from 1952 or 53 until she died in 1985. And now Sherm has built another house and sold the old house, but he's got a real fancy house, just real close to where they live.
And Sherman remarried.
Sherm remarried a young girl that had been on a mission, and she's a accomplished pianist. She's going to school right now.
Mm-hmm.
She's a school teacher, but they seem to be happy. She's I'd say in her 50s, and Sherm's 82.
Well, who Joe died in 85,
85.
and what was it that she died of?
She died of a stroke. She was just going down the road, down Foothill Boulevard. She was going or coming from her hairdresser, and she felt kind of funny, and she pulled off the side of the road, and she waved a car over. And some woman stopped by, and she said, "Will you please call my husband?" She said, "I don't feel well at all." And Sherm said later that he heard the siren when they come to get Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Took her to the University Hospital. She went into a coma. She was in a coma for 3 days and died. She always felt like she was going to die young, and she didn't want to suffer, and she didn't want to be a burden on anybody. She kept saying, if I could die and get it over with, I don't want to be a burden like F.E. And yet she was still quite young. You know, she was only 67. No, she was born in 1920, and she died in 1985. So she was only 64 when she died.
Okay.
She's barely turned 64 the month before.
And at her funeral, what were some of the things that were said, if you remember? I went to the funeral too, and I don't know that I can, but as far as her greater accomplishments or what she felt was really important.
Well, she was really athletic. She rode a horse a lot. She really was a horsewoman. And they were having a parade in Eureka when her and Sherman lived in Eureka. And this horse was kind of wild, and he threw her off and hurt her. Well, she jumped right up and got right back up on the horse, just like if nothing ever happened. Francie made a big to-do about this in the funeral because she was really daring, and she set her mind to something, she'd do it. She's going to ride that cockeyed horse even though he threw her off, in front of everybody in town. She was in the parade.
Well, let's go back then to, you came home from your mission, and this is your second mission.
Yeah.
And then you decided on your next big goal in life, which was
To get married.
to get married.
And I met Rita in November of 1946.
Okay. What were the circumstances there?
A friend of mine had come up for a conference, an October conference,
Mm-hmm.
and he was from down out of Caliente. And I was going to the girl from the mission field, and I met him one day, and he says, I says, golly, why didn't you go home? He said, well, I stayed up because I've been taking a lot of treatments by a chiropractor. And I said, what happened? He said, I come upon a car at the 9 Mile Rock, 9 mile north of Panaca, and this car was laying on top of this guy. And he said, boy, I had to get it off. And he says, I just strained myself to death trying to get it off. And he says, I finally got it off, but he says, I ruined my back getting it off. And so he came to Salt Lake, went to conference, and then he made an appointment to go see a chiropractor every 2 or 3 times a week to try to help get his back in shape. I'd gone to high school with him. His name was Archie Yoko, like little Abner Yoko. And he says, why don't you give me a date and we'll go out together? And Reva was living at the Beehive House, and you had to have a recommend from your bishop to live there, just for Mormon girls to come and live in Salt Lake while they got a start in life. And Dixie was living there. Aunt Dixie was living there. And so this girl that I was going with, her name was Jane Gravel. She was a French girl in New York. And she went around and asked the different girls if they wanted to go on a blind date. And Reva was downstairs ironing her clothes. And Jane propositioned her to go out on a date. She says, no, I'm not interested. I've been out on blind dates before and I'm just not interested. So then she went around and tried everybody else, but it was on a weekend, and most of the girls would go home for the weekend. They were from Idaho and Nevada and all over. Excuse me. So finally, in desperation, she went back, and Reba was still down there ironing her clothes. She says, Reba, you really ought to go with me. The guy I'm going with is a returned missionary. And so she went with the other guy. That's how I met Reba. We went to a dance down in the old terrace ballroom. I think in those days they called it the Coconut Grove.
Uh-huh.
And it was considered the largest ballroom in America.
I was on 2nd South and Main.
No, it was on 5th South.
Oh, right. Yeah, then they tore that down.
They tore it down.
That was still around.
But then one day I went to Caliente to the show, and I met old Archie down in Caliente, and he says, when you going back to Panaca? And he said, well, I'm moving back to Salt Lake. And I said, I'm going back and see if I can see that one that you had. He said, are you really? And I said, yes. So I came back, and Reba was working at the presiding bishop's office. And Bryant Hinckley had an office in the presiding bishop's office.
Now that's Don's second son.
No, that's Don's, Sylvia's father.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sylvia's father. He lived to be 95 years old, and he wrote several books for the church. And Sylvia would proofread them, make sure his English grammar and everything was right. She was really a student at BYU. And Don met her down at BYU. They got married in 1940.
So you came back and pursued her.
I pursued her, and we got married on May the 8th of 1947. And Joe got married the 10th of June the same year. I actually beat Joe married. She got married on Effie's birthday.
And where did you go on your honeymoon?
We went down through the canyons, Zions and Bryces and Grand Canyon. Finally went over to Las Vegas. Saw Las Vegas. Of course, that's been a long time ago, almost 50 years ago.
Be darned. And you came back and you started working here in Salt Lake.
Got a job right here in this building.
First South and Main.
Montgomery Ward building. I was working in the basement selling appliances.
Okay.
And then after about 4 months, we lived on 4th Avenue. 4th Avenue and between D and E Street. And one day, when mother called and says, I wish you could come home for a little while. We got to get rid of the power line. Your dad's not feeling well at all. And we got a few things we got to get settled while he's still alive. And so we went back with the idea of staying for 4 months. And we stayed for 4 years. And we lived in the old castle, which was my dad's father's house that he had built when my dad was a little tiny boy.
John Nephi.
Nephi John.
Oh, whoops. Nephi John.
And he named his oldest boy John Nephi. Good guy.
Okay. And during that time, you had
Leslie, Mark, and Jeffrey were all born in Cedar City while we were living in Vernacular. And Reba loved it. We had to milk the cows, we had to take care of the cattle, and feed the animals and so on. And Reba just loved it because she was a farm girl. But I didn't like it, never did like Panaca, and still don't like it. When I decided to move back, she kind of drug her feet. She wanted to stay in Panaca. It was a happy time of her life. But I come back to Salt Lake, and I finally got a job working at the old Navy base out in Clearfield. I worked there for 16 years, and then I transferred to the post office and worked there for 16 years. But all the time, I was always had 2 jobs from 1957 until when I retired in 1982.
that was how many years? 32?
32 years government service.
Now, of course, during that time, you had a number of children, and one of,
No.
Oh, okay. What do you remember about your children? When, of course, now there's, why don't you mind, if you don't mind mentioning their nicknames? I think that's kind of cute to do that. Then you can go through and mention each of them.
Leslie is Hamilton K. Beach.
Where did that name come from?
I don't know.
Okay.
I still call her Hamilton K. Beach. Hamilton.
And then Mark?
Mark was Fulcrum. Jeffrey, you call him the Happy. I still call him the Happy. Jeffrey, the Happy. I don't know. Bandit K. Rooster was Janet. I still call her Bandit.
All
My
right.
niece was nursemaid. Stephanie was Stephania.
Did those names come from anywhere? Or they
No,
okay.
just Elaine. I always call her Elaine. I write to her all the time. I still call her Elaine.
And Carol?
Carol Patrice. It was when she was a little girl, she used to say, well, I said, what's your name? And she'd say, Me Cac. I couldn't say Me Carol. She'd say Me Cac. So I still call her Me Cac.
And then you call me?
Samuel.
All right.
Effie used to call Don Sam a lot. And Sam was a brother of my mother. I had an Uncle Sam. And he wasn't a bit religious. None of Karen's, none of Reva's, none of Mother's brothers were religious. And Mother used to say that the reason Uncle Foss was the most handsome guy that she ever saw in her life. And the bishop wanted him to go on a mission once, and he said, oh, I want to be Bobby. He said, if you don't go, you'll go straight down. And she said, boy, he got to drinking, and he really lived a horrible life. He did get married, and he had, 2 or 3 kids, but he never amounted to anything.
I realize we talked about these names earlier, and frankly, this is the first time I've heard a lot of these names, so I'm kind of forgetting. These are Florence's brothers?
Florence's brothers.
And Uncle Foss was?
His name was Fawcett.
Okay.
And the reason they called him Fawcett is because Mary Ann Rollins' mother was a Fawcett.
Mm-hmm.
So they called him Fawcett. They called him Foss. F-A-W-C-E-T-T. And then Uncle Bert, his name was Albert Aveson, and Uncle Sam, Samuel Aveson.
Just a second.
Uncle, can we turn it off?
Yeah.
Duplication?
Yeah, I'll be happy to give you duplication. So you think I have a future of Cecil being an elf?
Oh, Sam, I think you're going to make one called The Life of Moses. And I'll be Methuselah. How would that be?
Okay, here we go.
Hey, you're on.
Okay. Well, when you think about your children growing up, Leslie, what do you remember about these your kids growing up? I mean, what was Leslie like as a child?
Oh, she was a dream. She's still a dream. I've had people tell me just recently that of all the kids I ever had, they thought Leslie was the most beautiful. Leslie was really a beautiful girl. Gosh, she was handsome. She's
She's gone on and had
7